An increasing number of Christians have grown disillusioned with the kind of Christianity defined by, here's the things that you have to believe in order to be one of us. Actually, this is how many of us were raised to think that it meant to be a Christian in the noun sense, which is that the most important thing, actually the thing that God cares most about, is that you think and believe a certain way. And yet for many of us, our experience of the world is that it's far too complex for this narrow, primitive view. I mean, even if there did exist one singular, correct way to think about every aspect of Christian theology, how on earth could we ever ascertain which perspective, which tradition, which denomination has it right? I'd argue we can't. And even if a perfect perspective did exist, I don't know that we could ever find it or that we would even know it if we had it. Which means either we're left in despair. Woe is us. We can't know the exact perfect way to think about everything. Or we accept the situation as it is and we look elsewhere to find meaning and purpose. In other words, what if it's not about getting everything right in the belief sense? What if it's not about the correct ideas? What if being Christian in the verb sense actually is more important than figuring out what a Christian is in the noun sense? And stick with me here. What if this move necessitates that we permit a certain kind of subjectivity to coincide with what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, aka someone who practices Christianity? Another way to say that, how one person Christians, and yes, I'm using that word here as a verb, will not only probably look different from how another person Christians, but it might actually require it on some level. Why is that? Well, I think it's kind of simple. Everyone's context is a little, or sometimes a lot, different. Our backgrounds, our histories, our culture, our family of origin, our socioeconomic status, our ethnicity, and so on. All of these variables turn the dials of our lives, tuning us to a slightly different frequency of existence, experience, and reality. So how we live, even how we live as it relates to our religious leanings, inevitably will be different from one another. Here's a few examples to illustrate what I'm getting at. Consider how being a Christian in the first century required navigating very different matters than it does now for us here in the 21st century. For instance, today, we might wrestle over the ethical implications of things like stem cell research and artificial intelligence, whereas they wrestled over ethical implications of eating meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. We take for granted today that slavery is a stain on our species' history, whereas they took such systems for granted, and therefore we're trying to figure out how to treat slaves or even how to be slaves in ways that honored the teachings and moral example of Jesus. Today, we split our personalities over and over again in multiple ways through social media apps, dating websites, office relationships, etc. Whereas life, I imagine, was more one-dimensional with regards to, well, this is who you are and this is how you relate to others 2,000 years ago. Now, I could go on with lots more examples, but I think you get the point. And we could also go to different time periods in history of 21st century to 16th century to 8th century and so on. But I think you understand what I'm saying. What it means to be Christian is obviously dependent upon so many different factors. Yes, of course, teachings from Jesus such as love your neighbor as yourself, this remains consistent throughout history, but precisely how you execute that, that's going to be subject to all sorts of variables. I'm conscious of how talking like this, so to consider a kind of subjectivity of what it means to be Christian, this might stress some people out. This might make some of you anxious. And if it does, I wonder, is that maybe something that to get curious about? Like, is it cause anxiety because maybe you've been conditioned to think that there is a uniformity expected by Christianity, or worse, a uniformity expected by God? In other words, Is it possible that you've been exposed to and taught to believe that there is one way that all humans ought to think and believe and act? And so our goal is to therefore be on that one singular path. If that's the case, and I would certainly understand if it was, because that's what a lot of conservative, evangelical, fundamental Christianity teaches, is certainly what I was taught growing up, then yeah, it would be really unsettling, really uncomfortable to consider. Not only are there different ways to be a Christian, as is evidenced by 2,000 years of diverse thinking on the matter, but there's also different ways to be Christian. For one, I find this notion liberating, even if I grant that there was a season of my life when it terrified me, precisely for the reasons that I just named. But nowadays, I think it's a gift to just relax around this kind of thinking. It's freer to accept and appreciate that people do Christian differently. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, Colby, are you just saying then that all ways of being Christian are equally valuable, viable, acceptable? Is it just, whatever's clever, you do you and I'll do me? Like, is that what you're saying? No, that's not what I'm saying. In saying that I think there are multiple ways to be Christian, I am not therefore implying that anything and everything goes, or that there's no hierarchy of good, better, best, and bad, worse, worst. Of course there are. This is why in my ministry I talk so much about what kind of fruit is being produced by any given belief or practice. The better the fruit, the better the belief, and so on. But yes, I think focusing on being Christian and how we live is actually more important than trying to be the right kind of Christian with regards to what we believe. And if that's true, then it must therefore be acknowledged that people have been Christian in their actions and behaviors differently over the past 2,000 years, precisely because there are so many factors and variables at play. And this kind of relativity, this kind of subjectivity, I think is actually a feature of Christianity, not a bug. However, we have been conditioned to label what is and is not real Christianity based on what a person believes, which has caused us to say things like, people who believe like this, or more like me, are real Christians, but people who believe like that are not. And I wonder if this is why Jesus encouraged, or you might even say admonished people to not judge one another.